Before the palace statements, television interviews, memoirs, and years of silence, there was one private conversation between two brothers. William believed Harry was rushing toward a decision that could change everything. Harry believed his brother had crossed a line, and neither understood how permanent that moment would become. At that point, Harry appeared certain of one thing. Meghan was the person he wanted beside him. He was protective of her, proud of the relationship, and increasingly determined to shield it from the pressures that came with royal life. To Harry, that certainty felt like strength. To William, it looked more complicated. He could see how quickly Harry's priorities were shifting, how rapidly major decisions were being considered, and how little room there seemed to be for hesitation. William's concern was not simply about Meghan. In his mind, the larger danger was the institution itself. Marriage into the monarchy was never just about two people. It meant schedules, scrutiny, expectations, hierarchy, duty, and a level of public judgment that could turn even small disagreements into national stories. William understood that burden better than almost anyone, and he worried that Harry was moving forward before fully grasping what both he and Meghan would be expected to endure. Yet, William hesitated. Harry had spent much of his life resisting the idea that he needed to be guided by his older brother. He hated being spoken to as though he were still the younger prince who needed protecting. William knew that. And beneath everything sat the memory neither brother could escape: Diana. That memory pushed them in opposite directions. William believed caution could prevent history from repeating itself. Harry believed caution was exactly how the institution allowed suffering to continue while everyone waited, watched, and said nothing. Eventually, William raised the subject. He expected discomfort, perhaps anger, but also honesty. Instead, the mood changed almost immediately. Harry heard doubt in William's words. Judgment, suspicion, what William intended as concern began to sound, to Harry, like another royal attempt to decide what was best for him. William allegedly urged him not to confuse protecting Meghan with rushing every major decision. But Harry barely heard the distinction. What reached him was something much more painful. William did not trust Meghan. Worse, perhaps William did not trust Harry's judgment either. The conversation never truly recovered from that moment. It ended without shouting, without resolution, and without either brother understanding just how much had changed. But something had shifted. A new distance had appeared between them, small enough to ignore at first, yet powerful enough to shape every disagreement that followed. From then on, each future conflict would be filtered through that first wound. William would see Harry becoming harder to reach. Harry would see William becoming another voice of the institution. But William had not decided to speak because of one uncomfortable feeling, and the events that reportedly pushed him toward that warning had been building quietly for weeks. William's warning did not begin with one explosive incident. It began with smaller moments almost nobody outside the palace could see. Changing conversations, uncomfortable questions, conflicting expectations, and Harry's growing frustration with royal life. Separately, they seemed insignificant. Together, William allegedly saw something he could not ignore. In the weeks before the brothers' confrontation, William had been watching Harry change in ways that were difficult to define but impossible to miss. Harry seemed less patient with palace procedure, less willing to accept the quiet rules that had governed royal life for generations, and more frustrated by the idea that personal wishes sometimes had to surrender to institutional expectations. Decisions that once would have been handled through routine discussion now appeared to carry emotional weight. To Harry, these were not minor disagreements. They were signs that the system was asking too much. Meghan entered that world with a different sense of how life should work. She was used to direct communication, personal independence, and having a stronger voice over how she was represented. Inside the royal household, however, those instincts collided with a culture built around precedent, hierarchy, and caution. Nothing moved quickly. Almost nothing belonged entirely to one person. Even simple choices could pass through layers of approval before becoming reality. At first, William did not assume that meant disaster. He understood that royal households could be suspicious of anyone unfamiliar, and he knew that some resistance might have less to do with Meghan personally than with an institution uncomfortable with change. So when complaints reached him, he did not automatically accept every version. But the pattern worried him. Harry appeared to be taking criticism surrounding Meghan more personally than before. Questions about schedules, staff decisions, publicity, or protocol increasingly seemed to become questions of loyalty. If someone challenged a choice, Harry could hear it as an attack on the woman he loved. And that, William allegedly feared, was turning ordinary tension into something much harder to contain. Catherine noticed the shift too. She understood William's concern, but she also understood Harry. Push too hard, she warned, and William might create the very distance he was trying to prevent. Harry had always reacted strongly when he believed others were making decisions for him. Now, with Meghan involved, that instinct was stronger than ever. William could not escape another thought. He had watched what royal pressure had done to his parents. He knew how quickly private tension could become public pain. In his mind, saying nothing was beginning to feel irresponsible. And slowly, his deepest concern changed. It was no longer simply about whether Meghan could adapt to royal life. It was about Harry's growing belief that protecting his relationship required rejecting anyone who questioned it. That decision brought William back to his brother, but this time, the conversation would go far beyond asking Harry to slow down, because Harry wanted to know exactly what William was afraid of. Harry could tolerate vague advice. What he could not tolerate was the suspicion that William was hiding what he truly believed. So the conversation became sharper. Harry pushed. William stopped speaking carefully, and somewhere between concern and accusation, two brothers who had survived unimaginable grief together began saying things neither could easily take back. Harry wanted clarity. If William had doubts, he wanted them spoken openly. No careful palace language. No soft warnings disguised as brotherly advice. He pressed until William finally admitted what had been troubling him. Harry seemed so consumed by the intensity of the relationship that he might not be seeing what royal life would eventually demand from both of them. To Harry, that sounded like an accusation against Meghan. He wanted specifics. Was William suggesting she could not handle the pressure? Did he think she wanted something from the monarchy? Did he believe Harry was being manipulated? The questions came quickly, and William found himself trying to explain something far more complicated than simple distrust. He insisted the problem was bigger than Meghan. Marriage into the royal family did not connect someone only to a husband. It connected them to duty, hierarchy, public scrutiny, expectations, and almost no true privacy. Every personal decision could become institutional. Every disagreement could become political. William believed Harry was treating love as though it could somehow exist outside those pressures. Harry rejected that completely. In his mind, William had become too comfortable with the system, too willing to accept rules simply because they had always existed. Harry argued that a life controlled by protocol was not the same as a life freely chosen, and if William could no longer see that difference, then perhaps the institution had already changed him. That accusation struck deeply. William countered that Harry was acting as though his choices affected only himself. They did not. Every major decision rippled through the family, the staff, the monarchy, and the public role they had inherited. To William, responsibility meant thinking beyond personal happiness. Then the argument reached the place neither brother could discuss without pain. Diana, Harry accused William of forgetting what they had learned from losing their mother, that silence, delay, and obedience could destroy people while the institution protected itself. William was stunned. In his mind, Diana's suffering was exactly why he was urging caution. And there it was, the same tragedy had taught them opposite lessons. William believed survival required patience, compromise, and understanding the system before fighting it. Harry believed survival meant protecting the people you loved before that system had the chance to crush them. By the time the conversation ended, neither man felt understood. Harry left convinced that Meghan would never truly be accepted. William left believing Harry now saw every challenge as betrayal. They were no longer debating a relationship. They were questioning each other's judgment, loyalty, and understanding of the life they had survived together. And once trust between the brothers was damaged, the conflict escaped the room where it began. Spreading into the place, royal disagreements become far more dangerous, the machinery of the palace itself. Royal families rarely announce when relationships are collapsing. The evidence appears elsewhere: separate offices, altered schedules, fewer private meetings, guarded staff, and increasingly formal messages between people who once needed none. Soon, William and Harry's private disagreement was no longer private. Everyone around them could feel the temperature changing. The first signs were subtle. Conversations that once happened directly between the brothers began passing through aides. Small decisions about appearances, announcements, press strategy, and household responsibilities suddenly carried more weight than they should have. What looked routine on paper was becoming emotional underneath. Every request seemed to contain a hidden message. Every delay could be read as disrespect. Every disagreement risked becoming proof that one side was trying to control the other. Harry increasingly believed the palace was not helping Meghan adjust, but resisting the way she wanted to work. Customs were expected to be understood even when they were rarely explained. Decisions moved slowly. Individual preference often came second to precedent. Meghan, used to more direct communication and greater control over her own role, reportedly found that deeply frustrating. To her and Harry, the rules could feel less like guidance and more like barriers. William saw something different. He believed staff were being asked to accommodate a level of freedom that did not fit easily inside a system built on shared discipline. Royal life, as he understood it, demanded compromise from everyone. Harry, however, increasingly seemed to view compromise as surrender. Charles recognized the danger but hesitated to choose sides. He knew that openly backing William could push Harry further away, while siding with Harry could weaken the structure William believed he was defending. So he searched for balance, but balance was becoming harder to find. The Queen's instinct was even more traditional: patience, privacy, and restraint. Under normal circumstances, those methods had protected the monarchy for decades. Here, they seemed powerless. Silence did not calm the situation. It created space for suspicion. Catherine tried to maintain warmth, but even ordinary gestures became difficult. A missed invitation, a delayed call, a private conversation, almost anything could now be interpreted through the rivalry growing between the households. William finally made a deliberate choice. He stepped back. He stopped offering Harry the kind of advice he once would have given freely, fearing that every intervention would be heard as another attack. But Harry did not experience that retreat as restraint. He experienced it as abandonment. And that may have been the most dangerous shift of all. Staff began to sense that this was no longer simply a disagreement over Meghan or palace procedure. William and Harry were beginning to imagine two completely different versions of modern royalty, and only one institution existed to contain them. For Harry, a troubling question was taking shape. If every attempt to live differently created another battle, perhaps the problem was not how he was living inside the system. Perhaps the problem was the system itself. What began as a question about whether Harry was moving too quickly was now becoming something much bigger, because Harry was starting to wonder whether the life William wanted him to preserve was a life he wanted at all. William's deepest fear was never simply that Harry might make a mistake in love. It was that royal pressure would eventually force his brother into an impossible choice: marriage or monarchy, personal freedom or duty, Meghan or the institution. Then, Harry began considering the one option nobody believed he would actually take. By now, Harry no longer saw distance as defeat. He saw it as protection. The more trapped he felt by palace expectations, the more attractive a different life became. One where he and Meghan could make decisions without every choice being filtered through tradition, advisors, and public duty. Meghan, too, could imagine what that freedom might mean: less scrutiny, more control, and the chance to define their family outside the constant weight of royal expectation. At first, the idea was not necessarily to walk away from everything. There were discussions about balance. Could they step back from the most demanding parts of royal life while still serving the crown in some form? Could they build greater financial and personal independence without cutting every formal tie? To Harry, that seemed like compromise. To the palace, it raised a far more difficult question: how much freedom could one couple have while still representing an institution built on shared rules? When William learned that the possibility was serious, the consequences hit him at once. This was no longer a family disagreement. It carried constitutional questions, financial complications, security concerns, public fallout, and the risk of turning private resentment into an international spectacle. And beneath all of that sat a bitter irony. His first warning had been meant to stop Harry from reaching exactly this point. But William never said, "I warned you." He knew those 4 words could destroy whatever trust remained between them. Instead, he pushed for caution while Charles searched desperately for middle ground. Yet every compromise seemed to satisfy no one. Harry believed the palace still wanted the final say. If he accepted a partial solution, he feared he would simply return to the same cycle: permission, resistance, frustration, resentment. William saw the matter very differently. To him, Harry wanted the freedom of an independent life while keeping parts of the royal position that only existed because of collective responsibility. The conflict had now moved beyond Meghan. At its core was something even more explosive: who had the right to decide the terms of Harry's life? Harry eventually reached his answer. His immediate family came first. If remaining in the old structure meant continuing the same battles, then he was prepared to step away from the role he had known for most of his life. William understood what that meant emotionally. Physical distance could harden wounds that still had a chance to heal. Once Harry left, casual conversations would become rarer, misunderstandings would become harder to correct, and one day, the story of why it happened would inevitably be told. That created a new danger for everyone involved. Whoever explained the rupture first could shape how the world understood every argument that came before it. Leaving the royal system could create distance from palace control, but it also removed the wall that had kept years of private anger from becoming a public story. Once private memories entered the public arena, nothing remained simple. A sentence remembered by William as concern could be described by Harry as rejection. Silence intended as restraint could look like guilt. And suddenly, the argument that began between 2 brothers belonged to millions of strangers choosing who they believed. Harry began explaining his side of the story more openly. He spoke of feeling isolated, unheard, and increasingly convinced that he and Meghan had been left to face intense pressure without enough support. To him, going public was not simply about exposing private pain. It was about correcting a version of events he believed had already been shaped by others. But once those memories were spoken aloud, old conversations changed meaning. Words exchanged in private, during moments of anger or fear, were now judged by people who had never heard the tone, seen the hesitation, or understood what happened before and after. William's warning became one of those moments. Was he trying to protect Harry from a mistake, or was he trying to stop him from choosing Meghan? The answer depended almost entirely on who was telling the story. For William, the dilemma was brutal. If he answered publicly, he risked dragging the feud deeper into the open. If he stayed silent, Harry's version could become the one remembered. Palace restraint, once seen as protection, now felt increasingly dangerous. Silence no longer stopped controversy. It gave speculation room to grow, and Meghan remained at the center of that public storm, even though the deepest wound had become something else entirely. By this stage, the conflict was no longer simply about whether Meghan had been accepted. It was about trust between William and Harry, about who had betrayed whom, about who had tried to protect the family, and who had exposed it. Harry felt he had no choice but to defend himself, because he believed people had been talking about him for years. William believed the opposite, that some family pain should never be turned into public material, no matter how angry anyone became. Each new revelation hardened those positions. Harry saw silence as coldness. William saw disclosure as proof that private trust was no longer safe. Then, the story took another turn. New recollections began to emerge from the period before the brothers finally broke apart. They suggested William's concern may have started earlier than Harry realized, and may have been far more detailed than one tense conversation could reveal. Instead of one sudden warning, there were hints of a longer internal struggle, questions William had allegedly carried quietly before deciding to confront his brother. That raised the question the entire story had been moving toward: what, exactly, did William believe he was seeing before he finally spoke? And that question leads directly to the details now changing the story. Because the warning Harry remembered as one offensive conversation may actually have been the final stage of a much longer private struggle inside William. The newest details do not point to one secret incident that magically explains everything. They reveal something more complicated. William had allegedly been debating whether to intervene long before Harry knew it, watching several pressures collide at once. His concern was not merely Meghan. It was what Harry was becoming willing to sacrifice. According to the emerging version of events, William had already spoken privately about his worries before confronting Harry directly. The concern was not built around one dramatic accusation. It was built around a pattern. William allegedly believed Harry's circle of trust was becoming smaller, tighter, and more dependent on people who reinforced what he already felt. Anyone who questioned his choices risked being pushed farther away. That worried William, because several different pressures were beginning to blur together in Harry's mind. Hostile coverage from the press, resistance from palace officials, cautious advice from family, and criticism of specific decisions could all begin to feel like parts of the same attack. Once that happened, ordinary disagreement became almost impossible to separate from betrayal. William was also troubled by how quickly nearly every major choice seemed to become tied to one question: would this protect Meghan, or expose her to more pain? To Harry, that was love and loyalty. To William, it risked turning every disagreement into a test of devotion. Catherine reportedly understood why William was uneasy, but she also understood the danger in how he expressed it. If Meghan's name became the focus, Harry would hear only one thing: that his brother was blaming her. And once Harry believed that, the deeper concern would disappear beneath the insult. That is what makes the warning look different now. William's fear was not simply that Meghan would change Harry. It was that Harry's determination to defend the relationship might slowly isolate him from the people, duties, and structures that had shaped the rest of his life. But Harry's position had its own brutal logic. If he believed the system was failing Meghan, then accepting caution could feel like repeating the same kind of failure he associated with Diana. Waiting, compromising, staying quiet, those were not neutral choices to him. They carried painful meaning. So both brothers may have seen something real. William may have recognized the danger of isolation, but delivered the warning in the one way Harry was least able to hear. Harry may have recognized genuine flaws inside the institution, yet grown so defensive that even sincere concern sounded hostile. That is the tragedy hidden inside the new details. There is no clean victory. William could later watch some of his fears take shape and still feel no satisfaction, because the cost was not proving Harry wrong. The cost was losing access to him. And that leaves one final question hanging over everything. If William could speak to Harry now, without advisors, cameras, books, headlines, or anyone else between them, would he still choose the same words? Because after all the revelations, arguments, departures, and accusations, the story finally returns to where it began, not with Meghan or the monarchy, but with two brothers and one conversation neither was ever able to undo. If William believed time would eventually prove him right, reality offered no victory. Harry built the life he had fought to protect. William remained inside the institution he believed needed defending. But the consequence neither man fully anticipated was far more personal. Somewhere along the way, each lost the brother he remembered. Seen from the end of the story, William's original warning carries a different weight. He had feared the speed of Harry's decisions, the growing isolation, the pressure of royal life, and the possibility that every disagreement would eventually become a battle over Meghan. To William, those dangers were real enough to justify speaking up. Harry saw the same world through a completely different lens. He feared hesitation. He feared palace control. He feared hostile scrutiny becoming normal. Most of all, he feared failing to protect the woman he loved when he believed his own family had the power to do more. That is where the tragedy becomes almost impossible to separate from their past. Both men were shaped by the same childhood. Both remembered what happened to Diana. Both believed they had learned from it. Yet the lessons they carried forward were almost opposite. William believed stability required patience, discipline, and knowing when to compromise. Harry believed survival required acting before the system could dictate the outcome. Each thought he was escaping the mistakes of the previous generation. Instead, they created another family fracture of their own. William's caution failed because Harry did not experience it as care. He experienced it as resistance. Harry's determination gave him more control over his future, but that freedom came with an extraordinary cost. The brother who had once stood beside him through grief, public pressure, and the strange burden of royal life became someone he could no longer easily trust. And by then, Meghan was no longer the whole story. The deepest conflict belonged to William and Harry themselves. William may have wondered whether different words could have changed that first conversation. Less warning, more listening, less emphasis on risk, more acknowledgement of what Harry believed he was fighting for. Harry, in quieter moments, may have faced an equally difficult question, whether some of William's resistance had contained genuine fear for him rather than simple hostility toward Meghan. That uncertainty is what makes reconciliation so difficult. It would demand more than a handshake at a ceremony or a few polite words in public. Both brothers would have to accept that their own memory of the past might not contain the entire truth. They would have to admit that love and resentment can exist together, that protection can feel like control, and that loyalty can sometimes leave destruction behind. More details may continue to surface. More accounts may attempt to explain who was right and who was wrong. But every new revelation only makes William's warning feel less like a triumph and more like a warning nobody truly escaped. Because if William was even partly right, the price of being right was devastating. And perhaps that is the detail that matters most now. William may have tried to warn Harry about what he believed was coming. But neither brother understood that the greatest thing they were about to lose was not a title, a role, or a place inside the monarchy. It was each other.